In the misty forests of Oregon, a veteran and his loyal dog stumble into a mystery that will change everything. Stay with us until the end. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. The fog in the Oregon mountains was alive. It rolled down from the ridges like a slow tide, swallowing the tops of the Douglas firs and muffling the world beneath it. To most people, it was a suffocating presence, a curtain that cut them off from the sun. But to Arthur Corrigan, it was a shield. At 49 years old, Arthur had learned to value silence, and the mist gave him just that, softening the edges of the world and sometimes even the edges of his own memories. His small wooden cabin sat deep in the woods, reachable only by a muddy trail that twisted for miles through the trees. For Arthur, that isolation was not an accident. It was medicine. He had carried the weight of battlefields home with him, images of smoke, of chaos, of friends lost, and here, in the shadows of Oregon's forests, he tried to set it all down. On the porch beside him sat his only companion, a German shepherd named Ghost. The dog was 5 years old now, a powerful animal with a silver-gray coat that shimmered almost white when the fog was thick. His amber eyes were sharp, intelligent, and always on Arthur, as though tethered to him by loyalty that no chain could match. Arthur often told himself that without Ghost he might have drifted away entirely, lost in the silence he had once thought he needed. The dog gave him reason to rise each morning, a steady heartbeat that kept him from fading into the mist. That afternoon, the air had been deceptively calm, heavy with the quiet that comes before a storm. Arthur had been repairing the old fence behind the cabin while Ghost patrolled lazily along the tree line, nose to the ground. Then, without warning, the sky darkened. The stillness broke with a low growl of wind moving through the pines. Arthur straightened and watched as clouds turned from gray to a bruised purple. The forest seemed to tense, the way soldiers stiffen just before orders come down. When the rain came, it was sudden and merciless. Sheets of water hammered the cabin roof, rattled the shutters, and turned the ground to mud in minutes. The wind whipped harder, bending the tall firs and breaking branches that crashed to the forest floor. Inside the cabin, Arthur tried to calm Ghost, who paced the length of the room, whining low in his throat. "Easy, boy," Arthur said, crouching to place a hand on his back. His voice was steady, the same tone he had once used to calm terrified young Marines overseas. "It's just noise. We're safe." But the storm wasn't just noise. Lightning split the sky and thunder followed so violently that it shook the walls. Then, somewhere close by, a massive branch gave way and slammed to the ground with a crack like gunfire. That was all it took. In a blur of fur and fear, Ghost bolted. He lunged past Arthur's reaching hand, hit the cabin door with his full weight, and forced it open. Before Arthur could even shout, the shepherd was gone, swallowed by the storm and the trees. For a heartbeat, Arthur stood frozen, the echo of the slammed door ringing in his ears. The image of Ghost's panicked eyes burned into his mind. Then instinct overtook him. He grabbed his rain slicker from its hook and pulled it over his shoulders, seized the heavy flashlight from the shelf by the door, and plunged into the storm. The rain was a barrage of icy needles against his skin. The wind tore at his clothes and made every breath a struggle. His old injury, the shrapnel wound in his leg that never fully healed, flared with sharp, familiar pain as he trudged into the forest. None of it mattered. He cupped his hands around his mouth and bellowed into the downpour. "Ghost!" The storm swallowed his voice. He shouted again and again, but it was like trying to call across an ocean. Each answer was only wind, thunder, and the crash of branches. The forest was no longer the refuge he knew. It had become a battlefield, chaotic and merciless, and once again he was running into it, searching for someone he couldn't bear to lose. That night was a blur of misery. He combed the woods with his flashlight, the beam cutting shaky paths through the rain, illuminating nothing but wet bark and dripping moss. His boots sank into mud, his hands grew numb, and every snap of a twig sent his heart leaping in hope, only to collapse into despair when it was nothing. Morning came gray and cold, but still he searched. The storm had left the forest wounded, trees down, the ground torn into a bog, creeks running high with muddy water. He moved through it like a man possessed. He hardly ate. His throat was too tight with dread to swallow. He hardly rested. Closing his eyes only brought visions of ghosts lost, hurt, or worse. By the second day, the silence became his enemy. The forest, once a balm, now mocked him, with every rustle of leaves that was not his dog. Every cry of a raven or scurry of a deer reminded him of what was missing. Ghost had been more than a pet. He had been an anchor, a steadying presence in a world Arthur sometimes struggled to endure. Without him, the old loneliness crept back in like a poison. By the third day, Arthur was breaking. His body ached. His legs screamed in protest with every mile. His throat was hoarse from calling a name that never answered. He stumbled through the rain-slick underbrush like a ghost himself, hollow-eyed and gaunt. Finally, at the base of a massive cedar draped in moss, he collapsed against the trunk. Water dripped from the brim of his hat, ran cold down his back. His breath came ragged and shallow. He whispered the dog's name one last time, the sound a broken prayer. Ghost. He sat there for what might have been minutes or hours, adrift in a fog of despair. His mind began to fold inward, the way it had in the darkest moments of his past, those nights overseas when loss had felt like a bottomless pit. And then, just as he felt himself surrendering, there came a sound, a bark, faint but real. Arthur's head snapped up. His heart lurched in his chest. For a moment he thought it was a hallucination, a cruel trick of exhaustion. He held his breath and listened. There it was again, closer this time. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his leg, and stumbled toward the sound. Branches whipped against his face, mud sucked at his boots, but he pushed forward like a man running toward salvation. And then, through the tangle of ferns, he saw him. Ghost. The shepherd trotted into a small clearing, coat matted with dirt and leaves but otherwise whole. He bounded to Arthur, whining, pressing against him, licking his hands as though apologizing for his flight. Arthur dropped to his knees and buried his face in the damp fur, relief washing over him so hard it made him dizzy. "Good boy," he whispered, voice breaking. "Good boy." For a moment there was nothing but reunion, the bond between man and dog sealing again as though it had never been broken. But then Ghost pulled away. Instead of turning toward the trail that led home, the dog took several steps in the opposite direction, into deeper, darker woods. He stopped, looked back, and gave a sharp bark. Not playful, but urgent. Then he moved forward again, pausing only to glance back once more, eyes burning with insistence. Arthur hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to go home, to rest, to take the safety he had nearly lost. But there was something in Ghost's gaze, something he had never ignored before. "Trust me." So he did. Pulling himself upright, Arthur staggered after his companion, his exhaustion replaced by a new and unexplainable current running through him, a mix of confusion, curiosity, and the unshakable bond of loyalty. Ghost had not merely come back, he was leading Arthur somewhere. And, though he didn't know why, Arthur followed. Ghost moved like a silver wisp ahead of him, slipping between salal and sword ferns, never once looking away for long. Arthur followed, pushing through dripping brush that slapped cold water across his face and neck. The forest around them felt different the deeper they went. Older, heavier, as if the trees had grown used to being left alone and resented this intrusion. There was no trail here, not really. Ghost made one, nose to the ground, pausing at invisible signposts only he could read, then gliding forward with a confidence that made Arthur trust his next step before he saw it. The ridge broke without warning. Ghost stopped on the edge of a narrow rock fissure, veiled by vine maple and hanging roots, looked back, and gave a single low bark. Arthur sank to one knee, parted the curtain of branches, and peered through. Below, the earth dropped into a steep chute no wider than a hallway, its walls polished by ages of rain. Deer, elk, something had used this cut over many seasons and left it just navigable enough for a careful man and an agile dog. "Easy," Arthur said, more to himself than to Ghost. He worked his boots into purchase and started down, sideways, testing each foothold before committing his weight. Mud slicked the stones and sent pebbles clicking into the dimness. Once his bad leg protested with a hot spike of pain. But Ghost paused and waited, tail still, as if holding the descent steady by patience alone. Step by step, breath by breath, the light changed from the gray of the high forest to a deeper green, thick, suspended, cathedral-like. The chute widened onto a shelf of slick bedrock. Arthur stepped out and felt the world close in around him. He stood at the rim of a bowl-shaped valley carved into the mountain itself. It was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the fog outside. Sound seemed to fall flat here. No wind moved through the fir crowns. No birds called. Only the soft drip of water from moss-bearded ledges marked time, a slow metronome for a place that had forgotten clocks. Across the far end of the basin rose a ragged wall of earth and splintered trunks as tall as a house, the fossil of a landslide long ago. He could see where the hillside had torn itself free, raw olive earth now softened by moss and young cedar, then slumped until it sealed the valley like a stopper in a bottle. Behind that barrier, the world went on, unaware. Inside, a small, dark lake filled the bottom of the bowl, its skin so smooth it reflected the gloom like glass left in the sheen. Arthur had seen the aftermath of landslides before. This one was old, decades at least. The trunks embedded in the debris were not fresh kills, but blackened bones, bark sloughed away, roots holding nothing. He could imagine the day it happened. A winter storm, earth overloaded with water, the slope finally letting go and roaring down to dam the drainage. A single act, and an entire pocket of wilderness went sealed and silent. Ghost padded to the lake's near edge and stood, ears pricked. Arthur moved beside him. The shore was soft, a skin of black silt over clay that oozed around his boots. The water was dark enough to look bottomless. He scanned the far bank, then the surface itself, and at first saw only fallen logs that time had turned into velvet green rafts of moss. Then something drew his eye and held it. A line. Too straight, too clean. It ran a few inches under the surface for several feet, vanished in a patch of reflected sky, then reappeared at a different angle. Arthur squinted. The fog thinned for a breath, and the light settled. The straight line resolved into an edge, metal, not wood, coated in a soft rind of algae. He took 2 steps forward and another shape emerged, the water distorting it into a ghost of itself, a circular hub rising like a drowned crown, thick arms radiating from it, severed near their tips. His heartbeat changed. He knew rotors when he saw them. Arthur worked his way along the shore to a place where the bank curved inward, as if the water had nibbled a bite from the land. The mud here gave way to stone. He crouched and leaned out, one hand braced on the slick rock, and peered into the gloom. Details surfaced and locked into place. A rotor mast broken at an angle, a stub of a blade jutting upward like a rib, a length of tubular framework that could only be the hinge line of an upper rotor assembly. Not a log, not a trick, a helicopter, not small either. The portion above water was only a fraction, and even so, the geometry was vast compared to the fragile observation birds he had seen in old photographs. Whatever this was, it had been a giant in its day. He moved to a different vantage and saw more of it. The subdued arc of a canopy blister silted with algae, the curve of a fuselage swollen toward a cargo bay, a tail boom disappearing into the black water, its lattice remnants catching weeds like a net. The paint, what little remained, was a gray-green so faded it nearly matched the lake. On one exposed panel, he caught the ghost of a white star inside a roundel, the edges eaten by time. It was not mere civilian equipment buried by accident. It wore the bones of war. Arthur heard himself exhale, a sound too loud for the valley. This did not belong here. It did not belong anywhere, really, not in his mental map of history, and not in a landslide-locked bowl in the Oregon backcountry. He felt that tightening behind the ribs he associated with memory and threat and awe. He'd come looking for his dog and found the impossible. Ghost shifted, nails clicking on stone. The shepherd looked from Arthur to the lake and whined, soft, questioning. "We're okay," Arthur said, though he had no idea if that was true. He slid the flashlight from the loop at his belt and tested it, dry, bright. Then he scanned the shoreline until he found a shelf of rock jutting like a finger into the lake, its far end close enough to a slab of metal that broke the surface at an angle. He could almost step from one to the other. He did not think about it long enough to reconsider. In this valley that time had sealed, each pause felt like a hand closing a lid. He edged along the rock, boots leaving dark prints where lichen gave way. At the tip, he crouched and probed with the toe of his boot. The metal flexed a fraction under pressure, then held. He tested it with weight, then committed, stepping from stone to wreck. The panel was slick but broad, and in a moment he was kneeling on the sunken flank of the fuselage, his face inches above water as he peered down through it. A yawning cut in the fuselage told him where to enter. A cargo door shoved backward on its rails until time jammed it there, the upper edge now just above the lake. He rolled his shoulders, laid his chest across the lip, and slid inside with a grunt, dropping into knee-deep water that was shock cold even through his jeans. The temperature stole his breath. He bit down on the reaction and stood, water lapping against his thighs. The smell inside the bay was layered and old, wet metal, oil that had long since lost its sheen, the mineral funk of a place sealed away. His flashlight beam cut a cone through suspended silt, catching on hanging cables with their insulation rotted off, on the skeletons of bench frames along the bulkheads, on stenciled letters eaten by rust. He moved slowly, letting his eyes learn the new geometry. A rib of the fuselage arced over him like the inside of a whale's rib cage. "Stay," he called to Ghost through the door, more out of habit than hope. The shepherd answered with a small sound and settled on the rock shelf outside, posture alert, chin between his paws, watching. Arthur waded forward. The water rose to mid-thigh, then to his hips as the floor sloped, then fell away again where the fuselage had twisted and buckled. On the right, a bulkhead had cracked and peeled away, revealing a narrower compartment beyond, a crew rest or equipment bay. He angled toward it, one hand on a rib for balance, the other sweeping the beam low to catch anything out of place. There were signs of hurried life here, tie-down points scuffed raw, a strap frozen in a knot of rust, a tool left on a rack as if someone intended to return for it and didn't. In the back corner, beneath where a bunk must once have been bolted, A tangle of collapsed metal framed a dark rectangle that did not look structural. Arthur narrowed the beam and felt his chest tighten. It was a footlocker. Army issue green, gone almost black. Edges seamed with corrosion. The bunk had caved over it, pinning the locker under a bent support. Arthur wedged his shoulder against the bulkhead, planted his feet, and tested the support with both hands. It shifted a hair, but held. He scanned the bay for leverage and found a length of torn paneling curled like a leaf against the wall. He pried it free, wedged one end beneath the cross brace, and leaned. Metal complained in a long, dry groan. The brace moved another fraction. He reset the lever and leaned again, this time for all he had. The brace crept aside just enough to free the locker's corner. Arthur dropped the panel, got both hands under the lip, and dragged the footlocker into the open, its bottom grating across the floor with a sound that made his teeth hurt. The padlock was swollen with rust, the hasp fused. He found the sharp edge of the torn paneling again and used it like a chisel, driving it into the lock body with the heel of his hand until metal fractured. On the third strike, the shackle snapped. He pulled the lock free, raised the lid, and a stale breath of enclosed years lifted into his face. Inside lay a life. On top, wrapped in oilcloth that stuck and then came free with a wet whisper, were personal effects arranged with care. A shaving kit with a cracked mirror, a deck of cards turned into a single fused brick, a pair of flight gloves stiff as bark. Beneath them, in a canvas pouch, small photographs had fused at the corners. He teased them apart with patience learned from field chores done under worse pressure. A woman with 1940s curls smiled at the camera, a child on each knee. A man in fatigues stood beside her, eyes wary but proud. The back of one photo held a note in neat, practical script. Mary, Tommy, Ellie, summer on the river. At the bottom, under a folded sweater gone almost the color of the lake, his fingers found leather. He drew out a notebook bound in brown, the cover impressed with use. The strap had rotted to a thread, but the pages within were waxed at the edges, a small act of caution that had saved the inside from ruin. He held the book above the line of his flashlight and opened to the first page that would peel cleanly. A name printed there with the same neat hand as the photograph, Thomas Harker. Below it, a roll, flight engineer. Arthur felt a small, irrational jolt of recognition, as if the past had introduced itself and offered a hand. He turned the page. The first entries were tight columns of numbers and short lines of technical note, the language of someone responsible for systems no one else wanted to fail. Transmission pressure, rotor RPM under load, temperature climbs on extended hover, fuel burn at various altitudes. The margins held sketches, a gear mesh, a pulley path, a cross-section of a cooling duct annotated with arrows. He flipped forward carefully, choosing pages that separated without tearing, letting the narrative, if there was one, choose him. The tone changed a third of the way in. The numbers thinned out. Between them appeared sentences that were not for maintenance logs, but for a man's own keeping, written in a hand that quickened when thought did. Weather's worse in these hills than anyone planned on. The boys in procurement stamped the schedule with ink that won't blot. We're to lift on Tuesday, no deviation, cargo locked and covered before dawn. The captain doesn't like the overwater leg in winter. Says the winds run crosswise to the ridges and our weight leaves no margin. I told him the new gearing will hold. I hope I wasn't lying. Arthur wiped a drop of lake water from the page with his thumb and turned another. Ghost shifted outside, the soft thud of his tail on rock, an anchor to the present. Mary wrote, Ellie lost her first tooth and expects the quarter to be generous. Tommy asked if I will bring him home a real pilot's cap. I told her not to let him stay up late and stare at the Navy blimp when it passes. We are not allowed to talk about where we go. They gave us new patches without unit numbers, only the star. They painted over the old markings last week. Feels wrong to lift without a name. Another page later. The hand had changed again, letters cramped, pressure heavy, trial run with full load today across the valley and back. Transmission ran hotter than spec. Rotor droop in the hover more than I like. We bled air from the lines and checked the relief valve. Captain says the route is the route. I don't like the route. Too many ridges, too many places for the wind to push us sideways, I told the major. He said the cargo matters more than the helicopter and the men inside it. I didn't have an answer for that I could write down. Arthur felt that old, sour pang, the one that attends any sentence where equipment, weather, and orders intersect. He turned farther forward, near the last pages that would open. Lift at 0530, light snow, ice on the rails, de-ice kit not holding as promised. We're heavy by a margin. Told the captain I want to keep us out of the saddle east of the river. He nodded, said we'll see what the wind allows. Radio discipline strict. Cargo to remain sealed, no stops after the second ridge. If we lose power, we set down in the bowl. I don't like the bowl. Wind comes down it like a hand. Pray for a clean climb. The final page that would lift cleanly was a smear of pencil where water had crept in from the edge. The words were still legible if he angled the light just so. RPM fallen, ice on the intake, transmission temp spiking, downdraft in the saddle stronger than forecast, losing altitude, trying to clear the ridge. If we can reach the basin, It ended there, the line trailing into a gray that was more stain than ink. Arthur stared at it a moment, hearing in the pause the sound of every cockpit when problem stacks upon problem until the flight becomes a string of margins. He closed the notebook, not from fear of what came next, he already knew, standing in water inside this iron tomb, but from respect. He slid the journal under his jacket, inside the dry pocket of his slicker, and zipped it as far up as it would go. Then he gathered the photographs in the dog-eared canvas pouch, placed them back in the locker as neatly as his shaking hands allowed, and lowered the lid. He stood very still and listened. The valley's hush pressed close, unchanged. No voices, no engines, only the slow drip of time from stone to water. Arthur turned his light across the bulkhead one last time and fixed a few details in his mind that might matter later. A stenciled block of numbers nearly erased by rust. A manufacturer's plate with only the first two letters visible through patina. A strip of paint along a rib where a different color showed beneath the gray-green, as if someone had layered identities before the last flight. But he did not dwell. The plan, if he could call it that, was simple. Get out safely, get the journal and what memory could carry back to the cabin, and decide what to do when thought came easier than it did here. He waded back to the cargo door, hauled himself over the lip, and slid onto the cold metal skin outside. The air hit him and drew a shudder. Ghost rose at once, tail sweeping once in relief before settling again. Arthur took the last careful steps across the angled panel, reached the rock finger, and stepped onto stone. His boots left water-dark prints that filled instantly with sheen. He crouched and rested a hand on Ghost's neck. The shepherd leaned his weight into him, pressing the present against Arthur's palm. For a long moment they looked out together over the dark plain of the lake, the hub like a crown, the fragments of blades caught in weed, the curved back of a machine that had tried to lift and could not. "This place kept your secret," Arthur said softly into the valley. "For a long time." Ghost flicked an ear, as if he too heard that you could keep a thing safe and still lose it. Arthur stood. The way out was the way they came in. The narrow chute, the sideways steps, the patient fight with gravity. He took the first careful move and felt the journal firm against his ribs. Behind him, the lake reclaimed its surface as if nothing had disturbed it. The drip from the moss ticked on. At the top of the fissure, he paused and looked back once. The bowl already seemed to have swallowed the wreck again, blurring edges, smoothing lines, making a giant look like a rumor. He imagined snowfall in here in winter, layering over years until even that hint went away. He felt a hardening of something inside him that had been soft in the years of quiet, resolve, maybe, or the old habit of finishing what a beginning demands. Home, he told Ghost. They climbed into the fog, the valley's breath closing behind them like a door. Back at the cabin, the silence pressed heavier than before. The familiar walls, the battered pine table, the single narrow bed, they no longer felt like shelter. They felt like a vault filled with questions. Arthur placed the footlocker's recovered contents on the table with deliberate care. The tarnished dog tags, the fragile photographs, and the leather-bound journal that still smelled faintly of oilcloth. Ghost circled once at his side, then settled heavily by his boots, eyes watchful. Arthur lit the small kerosene lamp and sat down, the journal open in front of him. The handwriting was clear, though the paper had stiffened with water and time. Each entry belonged to Thomas Harker, flight engineer. Each page brought him closer to understanding the strange drowned bird in the valley. At first, the writing was clipped and technical, rotor speeds, fuel ratios, system notes. But soon Harker's voice crept through the figures. He wrote of the Oregon weather, rain that never stopped, winds that bullied their craft, doubts about the safety of their route. More telling were the entries about secrecy, patches sewn over unit numbers, orders without explanations, cargo sealed against inspection. Arthur read late into the night. The final words trailed into panic. The handwriting pressed so hard it nearly tore the page. Losing altitude fast. If we can reach the basin. The sentence broke in mid-stroke, the pencil dragged across the page by a sudden hand. Arthur stared at it for a long time, feeling the old familiar weight of unfinished missions. He closed the book and rubbed his temples. A duty stirred in him, the same one that had driven him through deserts and jungles years ago. Men had died here. They had been forgotten, their story buried beneath decades of silence. Someone had to remember them. The next morning, he powered on his old laptop, a battered machine that wheezed each time the fan kicked in. The satellite connection was weak, barely good enough to load a page, but it was all he had. He typed the name, Thomas Harker, USAF. The screen loaded slowly, then offered nothing but scattered records, men who weren't him, lives that didn't match. Arthur tried again with serial numbers, squadron designations, anything that might link to the journal. Nothing. He sketched the strange faded insignia he had seen on the fuselage, a variation on the U.S. star, but wrong somehow, and searched military archives. Again, nothing. It was as if the helicopter had never existed. Frustration hardened into resolve. He knew better than to post carelessly online, but he also knew the power of others who chased military history with zeal. Finally, he navigated to a forum he had once heard of, Wings of History. The place was filled with long threads dissecting rivet patterns, debates over forgotten prototypes. If anywhere held answers, it was here. Arthur created an anonymous account, Oregon Observer. His post was short, measured. While hiking in a remote part of Oregon, I came across wreckage of a large Wabupo-era military helicopter. It carries an unusual insignia, not standard USAF. I also recovered personal effects of a man identified as Lieutenant Thomas Harker, flight engineer. Does anyone know of an experimental, long-range transport project fitting this description? He uploaded one photo, a close-up of a corroded instrument panel, cropped tight to avoid revealing location. He hovered over the post button, then clicked. His heart thumped harder than it should have. He sat back, staring at the dim lamplight on the cabin walls, listening to the faint pop of rain on the roof. Ghost shifted in his sleep, but Arthur's mind stayed awake. The replies came faster than expected. Within the hour, there were dozens. Some called it a hoax. No Wo-2 helicopters that size existed. Stop wasting our time. Others argued fiercely about what little detail they could see. The dial placements, the gauge markings. He scrolled, scanning the lines, until one reply stood out. It was a private message. Dr. Evelyn Reed. Her profile marked her as a military historian, author of several works on declassified aviation projects. Her words were precise. What you describe matches rumors I've studied for years. There were whispers of an experimental, long-range transport helicopter, code name Albatross, that vanished in 1944 over the Pacific Northwest. All official records were destroyed or sealed. The name Harker is familiar. Please, if you are willing, share more. I promise discretion and whatever assistance I can offer. Arthur felt a sliver of relief. At least one person believed him. Someone with credentials, someone who didn't dismiss him as a crank. But even as that thought settled, another notification appeared. Then another. New private messages from accounts created only hours ago. Their tone was entirely different. The first was blunt. Provide coordinates immediately. This is government property. You are in violation of federal law. The second was worse. You are meddling with things you do not understand. Some wreckage is best left where it lies. Walk away for your own good. Arthur's jaw tightened. He closed the laptop slowly, the click echoing too loud in the small room. He sat in the dark, one hand on Ghost's thick ruff. The dog shifted, sensing his unease, and gave a low, questioning whine. For years, Arthur had wanted nothing but peace. Now, with a single discovery, he felt the world leaning in on him again. Shadowy, watchful, dangerous. He had no illusions about what those messages meant. This helicopter hadn't simply been lost to weather. It had been erased. And someone still wanted it erased. The next day confirmed it. It was late afternoon when Arthur heard it. The distant growl of an engine. Not the thunder of a logging truck on the far road, but a low, steady hum crawling up his muddy track. No one came here. Ever. He rose from his chair, Ghost already on his feet, a growl vibrating deep in his chest. A black sedan emerged from the trees, too polished, too perfect for this rugged land. It stopped in the clearing before his cabin. Two men stepped out, dressed in dark suits, their leather shoes sinking into the mud. They looked like they had walked straight out of a federal building in Washington and onto Arthur's property. The taller one approached first, his voice smooth, practiced. "Arthur Corrigan?" Arthur stood on the porch, arms folded, Ghost at his side. He gave a slow nod. "I'm Agent Foster," the man said, gesturing to his partner. "This is Agent Cross. We're with the Department of Historical Records. We believe you may have come across an item of federal interest on this land." Arthur studied them in silence. Their posture was wrong for archivists. The way their jackets bulged told him what hung beneath. Holsters, not pens. Their eyes scanned constantly, measuring exits, watching Ghost's every move. "I don't know what you're talking about," Arthur said evenly. Cross stepped forward, flashing a leather wallet with an ID card. Arthur glanced once and felt his suspicion harden. The seal wasn't quite right. The lamination lacked the embedded hologram any real badge would carry. A good fake, maybe enough to fool a civilian. Not him. Ghost growled low, hackles raised, teeth just beginning to show. Foster's eyes flickered, annoyance crossing the mask of calm. "Your dog seems agitated," Foster said smoothly. "He doesn't like strangers," Arthur replied. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then Cross's voice shifted, losing its polite edge. "Let's not waste time. An unauthorized report was made online regarding a classified wreck. Artifacts recovered from such sites are government property. We are here to secure them." Arthur didn't move. "This is my land." "Jurisdiction is complicated," Foster said, his tone still calm but sharper now. "Cooperation makes things simpler. Refusal complicates them." Arthur held his gaze, saying nothing. He had stared down worse men than these. Finally, Foster gave a faint smile, one that carried no warmth. "Very well. We'll be in touch." The two turned, walked back to their sedan, and drove away into the mist. Arthur stood there long after the sound of the engine faded. Ghost stayed rigid by his side until the last echo was gone, then looked up at him, amber eyes full of warning. Arthur rested a hand on his dog's head. "They'll be back," he said quietly, and he knew when they came again they wouldn't ask. He waited until the light went thin and cold, the hour when the forest seemed to hold its breath. The men in suits had left, but their visit had stripped away any illusion of safety. Arthur checked the journal zipper pocket one more time to be sure it was sealed, slid it inside his jacket, and shouldered a small canvas bag with the simple things he trusted. Nothing fancy, nothing that would slow him down. A length of rope, a folding knife, a flashlight, a roll of tape. Ghost stood by the door without being called, ears forward, body taut with understanding. "We go quiet," Arthur said, and the shepherd's tail flicked once in answer. They took the long way. No trail, no pattern, cutting across the slopes and angles that would break an easy tail and dropping into the narrow fissure only after circling twice to be certain they were alone. The valley received them with the same hushed pressure as before. The landslide wall loomed, the ragged teeth of old trunks black against a sky the color of steel. The lake lay still, a sheet of cold glass. If not for the blunt crown of the rotor hub and the pale curve of a canopy blister, someone might have called the place ordinary. Arthur worked along the rock finger and onto the helicopter's flank. The metal gave a muted groan under his weight. Ghost remained where Arthur pointed him, on the rock shelf near the door, head up, eyes following. Inside, the cargo bay was as he'd left it. Hanging cable skeins, ribs arching like bones, the smell of oil and damp metal. He moved faster now, the way he had on nights when everything depended on the minutes you could steal before the clock started to fight you. He waded forward until the water reached his thigh and then angled toward the front. The cockpit crouched ahead like a mouth, glass dulled by silt, panels collapsed inward by decades, levers and throttles frozen mid-gesture. Arthur slid across the torn threshold and crouched between the dead seats. His breath smoked faintly in the chill. He played the flashlight in tight sweeps over the bulkhead, across joints and seams, over places where a cautious crew might hide what orders told them never to carry. Nothing obvious, nothing meant for an uninvited hand. He slowed down, the way he would deconstruct a problem he didn't yet recognize. The left seat's frame had sheared at the floor bolts and punched a shallow crease into the partition behind it. Along that crease, paint flaked in a straight line. He brushed the edge with his thumb. Not flake, gap. He pressed his palm flat and felt a faint give where solid metal should have been hard. A panel within a panel. Arthur set the flashlight in the crook of the right seat and took out the folding knife. He eased the blade into the hair-thin seam and levered gently, listening for the sound every mechanic knows, adhesive surrendering. The strip lifted a fraction. He slid the blade farther, pried again, and this time something clicked, soft and deliberate, like a latch opening in another room. The panel swung inward on hidden pins. The compartment was small and dry. Inside lay a leather satchel, thick, stiff with age, the buckles still oiled enough to move. He drew it out and rested it across his knees. Even before he opened it, he knew what kind of weight he held. Documents kept like this weren't field checklists or ration logs. He slipped the strap free and lifted the flap. The first page filled the cone of light in a way that tightened his throat. The stamp was still legible in faded red ink. Top Secret. Below it, the header, Operation Starlight. Mission Brief. He turned pages with care. Flight charts traced a route that threaded ridgelines with the audacity of someone under orders. The course bent where normal doctrine would have gone straight. Decoy turns and odd holds marked as if to keep the helicopter's path away from eyes and aerial corridors alike. Schematics followed, dense, meticulous drawings of a device the size of a footlocker, coils, a gimbaled loop, an array that looked like the heart of a radio seen from the inside out. The legend called it a long-range direction finding beacon, RDF, Model B. Below typed notes, interference tolerance in mountainous terrain, frequency hopping protocol, ground test complete, flight test pending. At the back, a single-page report in a different hand, clipped to the file with the rusted staple. Engine performance degraded in icing conditions. Transmission temperature excursions under load. Recommend delay on over-mountain leg pending additional ground runs. The recommendation had been initialed, then crossed out with a diagonal slash. A date below it made Arthur's jaw flex. The week the journal said they lifted. He slid the satchel shut and tucked it into the canvas bag, then looked once more around the cockpit. On the panel above the captain's position, half buried under a tangle of dead wire, he spotted a small black tin no bigger than a pack of cigarettes. He pried it free and popped the lid. Inside lay spare vacuum tubes wrapped in wax paper and a folded rectangle of oiled cloth. He unrolled it and found to his surprise not tools but another sliver of paper, a codes card, 2 columns of letters matched to numbers, the sort of thing crews used to keep radio brevity clean and unreadable. He put the card back where it had hidden for 80 years, closed the tin, and set it exactly as he'd found it. He didn't need every secret. He needed enough. Ghost's bark cracked the hush from the cargo bay, short, sharp, the sound he used when strangers breached the line between far and near. Arthur froze. 1 heartbeat, 2. Then the dull, steady slosh of boots in shallow water reached him. Close and coming closer. Voices followed, low and clipped, the timbre of people who had practiced talking quietly with urgency. He killed the flashlight and let the cockpit go black. The afterimage of the satchel's stamp hung for a second in his sight like a negative. He breathed once, deep and quiet, and felt the old training wake up fully, the switch that flicked between civilian and something he hadn't been for years. Inventory. Doors, angles, sound. The cargo bay creaked as weight came onto the wreck. Metal rasped where gear touched ribs. A voice. 2 around the far side, near the door. Another voice, farther out. Nothing on the ridge. The entry team then, and a perimeter. 4 at least. Maybe more. Arthur slid backward until his shoulder found the bulkhead and his hand closed around a loop of hanging cable. At shoulder height, a curl of torn paneling hung like a bent leaf from a rib. He worked in the dark, fingers knowing what he needed. He tied the cable around the panel's free end, then stretched the loop across the cargo door frame to a bolt stub on the opposite side. A crude trip outline. He fed the slack up and over a cross member and put a touch of tension on it so that a boot would pop it loose and the panel, heavy and jagged, would fall. He felt Ghost's body heat in the open doorway before he saw the pale gray of his coat against the dimmer gray of the lake. The shepherd had slunk off the rock and come to the edge to warn him, then held the line like a good partner, outside the bay, head low, eyes forward. Arthur touched the dog's shoulder and felt the tremble of contained energy in the muscle there. He put his mouth to Ghost's ear and breathed the command he had used only a handful of times. "Go left. Fast." Ghost vanished in a blur of quiet motion. Arthur slid the rope from his bag and tied a quick loop around a length of wiring loom that dangled from the ceiling. He pulled the loose end back into the cockpit and knotted it around a chunk of broken frame so it would hold a little weight. Then he eased himself through a maintenance opening on the right side where a panel had torn away in a soft-edged mouth, small but big enough. He dropped into the lake up to his waist and went still, the cold hidden like a hand pressed flat to his spine. Against the helicopter's shadow, he was another dark shape in darker water. He held the bag close to keep it above the line and let the ripples die, then pressed along the fuselage toward the stern, the way you slide along a wall when you don't want a window to see you. Ghost broke cover on the far side of the wreck, exploding from brush in a thunder of paws and bark. He tore across the shallows, spray fanning, his voice huge in the bowl. The shout from the near side was immediate. "Movement! East bank!" Boots churned water, 2 sets at least, heavy, fast, eager. Arthur pictured them without needing to see, rifles up, eyes on the dog, training using the obvious as the necessary. Ghost hit the slope, disappeared into brush, and kept barking, farther and farther, drawing. The first man at the cargo door stepped inside and hit the cable. The panel came free and dropped like an anvil. The sound it made filled the valley with the violence of a bell, a sheet metal scream that erased every other noise. The man stumbled backward into his partner, both shouting, both momentarily blind to everything except the clang in their ears and the push of instinct to get clear of fallen metal. Arthur moved. 3 strokes took him to the tail, where the fuselage flexed into water deep enough to hide him even if someone put a beam straight down. He worked around the far side and came up under a brace that broke the surface in a crossbar. The air there tasted of rust. He took it in once, long, then turned his body and slid through cattails toward the shadowed edge where rock overhung water. "Dog's gone to the ridge," a voice shouted from the slope. Another voice, nearer and angrier. "Eyes on the bay. He's here somewhere." A third, calmer, a leader's cadence. "He won't leave his prize. Watch the sides." Arthur had already left it. He pulled himself into the weeds and crawled soundlessly along the saturate bank until brush swallowed him. The valley's acoustics did the rest, throwing sound back at the men so that they couldn't distinguish echoes from truth. He put 30 yards between himself and the wreck before he stood, hunched, and began to move up the bowl toward the chute. Steps careful, feet finding soil that wouldn't betray him with noise. On the far slope, Ghost quit barking. Silence fell for a beat that turned the men jumpy. Then the shepherd started again, from higher ground and farther out, a measured, taunting signal to say he could keep this game running longer than they could. Arthur felt a surge of gratitude so sharp it burned. The dog wasn't just noise. He was placement and timing, the difference between pursuit and confusion. The base of the fissure yawned ahead, a darker darkness and shadow. Arthur paused, listened once more, tracking voices, boots, gear, creak, the way operations sound when discipline is good but surprise is better, and then turned sideways and climbed. The chute forced him to use hands as well as feet. Mud slicked under his palms, grit bit into skin, and his leg flared in protest, but up was the only direction that mattered. He set the bag against his chest and hugged it close so it wouldn't swing and hit rock. Below, a flashlight's beam finally stabbed the cargo door, and someone swore, "Trap!" Another voice. He said it and slipped. "Where?" A third, losing calm. "Find him." Their impatience was a gift. Unsettled men make loud mistakes. At the top of the fissure, he pulled himself onto the forest floor and lay flat in the needles, chest heaving, ears open. The forest here felt like a different country. Wind moving in branches, a raven's hoarse question far off, the ordinary clatter of the world returning as if the valley had been a closed room in a loud house. He waited for Ghost. A minute stretched. 2. He forced himself to count breaths instead of seconds. When the shepherd arrived, he came in low and silent, slipping out a salaw like smoke. His tongue lolled, sides worked hard, but his eyes were clear. "Good," Arthur said, barely a whisper. He touched the dog's flank with the back of his hand and felt power there, spent but ready to spend again. With me, they didn't take the route home. They took no route at all. Arthur let instinct map a net of angles that used contour and brush to break lines of sight and eaves of rock to catch sound. When they crossed a small creek gone fat with recent rain, he stepped into it and walked upstream for 50 yards to mask their scent, then cut out over gravel where prints would be faint and confuse. Twice he stopped and listened for the sound of a second team flanking wide. He heard nothing but the retreating echo of men stuck at a problem they couldn't solve quickly without becoming noisy enough to be stupid. He didn't go back to the cabin. He went away from it, down a ridge he rarely used, into valleys where a dirt road would eventually remember how to be a road again. An hour later, mud to his knees and cold settled in his hands, he reached the single pump station at a highway that didn't know him. There was a payphone outside, old, the kind most people ignored now. Old was good. He fed coins into the slot and dialed a number he had written by memory into a scrap of paper from the journal's flyleaf. The number from Dr. Evelyn Reed's email signature, visible on the university website linked through the forum. The line clicked and rang. He watched the station window while it did, eyes scanning for a polished black sedan that didn't fit. "Dr. Reed," a woman said, voice clipped, cautious. "This is Oregon Observer," Arthur said. Saying the handle out loud felt odd. "We need to meet." A pause, small but telling. Then her voice changed, still controlled but with something underneath it. "You're safe to talk?" "For 15 seconds," he said. "I have the mission brief. Operation Starlight. Top secret stamp. Schematics, flight charts, a recommendation to delay the mountain leg that was crossed out." Another pause, shorter. "All right," she said. "Where?" "Small diner on Route 6, mile marker 31, back booth. Tomorrow, first light." He chose the place because it held no pattern for him, because the lot was open on 3 sides, because the booths were against the back wall with a mirror that let a person see the door without turning. "Understood," she said. "Do not call again. If you see anyone waiting before I arrive, leave and do not go home." "I wasn't going to," he said, and hung up. Ghost stood close enough that Arthur could rest a hand on his head while he watched the horizon. The sky over the ridges had gone colorless, the late light drained, clouds stacked like unspent waves. He leaned against the payphone's steel frame and let the adrenaline bleed off in small controlled breaths the way he had taught himself to do long ago. His hands shook once and then were steady. They moved again, choosing a different line away from the road, cutting back into trees where the world narrowed enough to manage. Night took them under its wing, and the forest's ordinary sounds returned. Owls trading notes, a distant coyote sending a single high question into the dark. Arthur found a hollow beneath a cedar, dry enough and defended by roots. He ate without tasting and gave Ghost a double portion for the work he'd done. The shepherd curled against his side and slept hard, a tremor now and then running through his paws as the day replayed itself behind his eyes. Arthur didn't sleep. He watched the dark and listened to the hour hand grind forward in his head. In the valley, men he didn't know were probably tearing apart the helicopter for the thing they wanted and the man who had already taken it. At his cabin, the door would be open at some point under hands that didn't bother with knocks. The only choices left were the ones he had already made. Carry the truth out where it couldn't be quietly erased and keep moving until the light hit it. Just before dawn, when the sky ripened from black to a thin gray that separated tree from tree, Arthur stood, stretched the stiffness from his back, and checked the satchel in the bag. The leather felt like a pulse. He tightened the strap, checked Ghost's paws for cuts, none, just mud, and set off toward the highway and the date he had made with daylight. He did not look back. The valley would keep its silence for others. He had stolen from it what mattered and owed it no more visits until this was finished. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and bacon fat. The kind of place where time didn't move much and strangers were noticed but not questioned. Arthur slid into the last booth against the far wall, his back to the corner, his eyes on the front door reflected in the cracked mirror above the counter. Ghost lay beneath the table, silent and invisible to anyone not looking for him. The satchel sat on the seat beside Arthur, its leather stiff and dark, the brass buckles dull with age. His fingers brushed its surface as if to confirm it hadn't vanished in the hours since he pulled it from the hidden compartment. Around him, the morning traffic of truckers and locals hummed, forks scraping, the bell over the door chiming once, then twice. Then she came, a woman in her late 50s, short hair streaked with gray, wire-rimmed glasses perched low on her nose. Her jacket was waterproof, her boots the kind that had walked more than hallways. Dr. Evelyn Reed. She spotted him immediately and crossed to the booth without hesitation. "Mr. Corrigan," she said, sliding in across from him. Her voice was calm, clipped, but her eyes, sharp, intelligent, flicked once to the satchel. Arthur pushed it toward her. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Everything's in there." She opened the flap and drew out the first file. The red stamp still glared even after 8 decades. Top secret. Her composure cracked for a moment, awe breaking through, then she forced it back. Page after page passed under her hands. Flight charts, technical diagrams, the crossed-out recommendation to delay the mission. She read in silence for nearly half an hour while Arthur drank coffee gone cold and kept his eyes on the parking lot. When she finally spoke, it was with reverence. This isn't a rumor anymore. It's proof. Operation Starlight, a helicopter far ahead of its time, carrying an advanced radio beacon that could have changed the Pacific War. Her voice hardened. And they buried it. They buried them. Arthur nodded once. And now someone else wants to keep it that way. Her lips pressed thin. "They'll come again, Mr. Corrigan. The only protection we have is daylight. Secrets like this rot in the dark. Dragged into the open, they can't be stolen back." Arthur leaned forward, his storm-gray eyes steady. "Then you'd better drag fast." Weeks later, the valley was no longer silent. Engineers in hard hats worked beside Air Force personnel, while historians moved carefully with notepads and cameras. A cluster of journalists stood behind cordons, their lenses trained on the lake. The wreckage that had slept for 80 years was finally being raised. Arthur watched from a ridge above, Ghost sitting calm at his side, tail resting in the moss. The heavy-lift Chinook hovered, its twin rotors thundering, whipping the lake into a frenzy. Straps cinched tight around the fuselage groaned as they took the weight. For a breath, nothing happened. Then, with a deep metallic protest, the helicopter rose. Water sheeted off in silver curtains, the tail boom dripping weeds, the rotors gleaming like broken wings. For the first time since 1944, the lost albatross felt the sun. Below, shouts rose, half triumph, half disbelief. Cameras clicked in rapid fire. Dr. Reed stood at the command tent, head high, jaw set, as if willing the machine into the light herself. But the shadows hadn't vanished. A convoy of black sedans pulled onto the temporary road cut through the forest. Men in dark suits climbed out, their shoes wrong for the mud, their faces carved in stone. At their head were Foster and Cross, the same men who had stood on Arthur's porch. They carried documents now, not holsters visible beneath jackets, but the threat was the same. They strode toward the tent, waving folders, shouting about jurisdiction, national security, property of the United States government. They demanded the operation cease immediately. Dr. Reed didn't flinch. She met them with her own counsel and an Air Force liaison at her side. Her voice carried, measured, and firm. She quoted statutes, invoked the public's right to preservation, pointed at the cameras that were now turned not on the wreck but on the confrontation. "You've hidden this for 80 years, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the rotor wash. "You won't hide it again." The agent's power wilted under the glare of lenses. Their veiled threats collapsed into empty air. Foster's calm mask cracked. Cross's pale eyes narrowed with fury, but neither could act. Too many witnesses, too much daylight. They retreated to their cars, the convoy vanishing back into the mist that had once hidden everything. Arthur watched it all unfold from his ridge. For the first time since finding the wreck, he felt something close to peace. The truth was no longer his alone. It belonged to history now, and to the families who had waited for answers far too long. Months passed. The helicopter was restored, piece by painstaking piece. Its story told in newspapers, documentaries, classrooms. The families of Harker and the others received medals, folded flags, and the simple, immeasurable gift of recognition. Their letters of gratitude arrived one by one at Arthur's cabin, each line a weight lifted. One evening, he sat on his porch as the Oregon sun slid behind the peaks, painting the sky an orange and violet. Ghost rested his head on Arthur's knee, breathing steady, amber eyes half closed in contentment. The journal lay on the table beside them, its pages safe, its story told. The forest was quiet again, but not the lonely quiet he once knew. It was full now, full of closure, of remembered voices, of a duty fulfilled. Arthur scratched behind Ghost's ears and whispered, "We did good, boy." Ghost's tail thumped once in reply, and together they sat watching the twilight settle, a soldier and his dog, guardians of a truth finally brought into the light.